Through a culmination of inspiring events, I felt the desire to do a little bit of fan art, and it actually caused me to focus on leveling up how I create art. And that's just what makes things fun, right? To pick something that sounds fun to draw, but be able to have so much fun during the process that it leads you to stop and think, what more can I do to this? What more can I add? How many ways can I challenge myself to push this piece a step further? That is pretty much the summarization of this piece. I'm going to show you a more in-depth behind the scenes of how I created my latest illustration and challenged myself to level up my art while having a lot of fun doing so. The process begins now. It's the Lily factor. Ding! Our story begins with these two sketches, one digitally and one in a sketchbook, that gave me an idea of what kind of angle I wanted to draw this character in. So when I began sketching this head, I realized, oh, this is gonna be the illustration. I better start recording this. But really, what is this illustration about, and why did I want to do it in the first place? Well, that's a myriad of reasons. We'll start with, on LinkedIn, there's this page called VLLO that posts like CGI related updates on like what the 3D animation artists are up to these days. And they posted this one artist referred to as Animist who did this stop motion animation recreating some scene from an anime. I don't know what the anime was called, but he did it with stop motion. And there's this shot where the character's like sliding back on a motorcycle, but the way this artist did it had like a lot of interesting visual effects and reflections on the character. And so I was like, oh, that's really inspiring. It kind of makes me want to draw a character on a motorcycle at some point. Then later on, the Sonic movie 3 trailer came out, and they, lo and behold, did the exact same reference to the motorcycle slide, but with shadow. And I was like, you know, I've been wanting to draw a character on a motorcycle, and well, I do love drawing me some Sonic characters. So I was like, oh, I definitely want to draw a shadow on a motorcycle. So the idea for this illustration was that, but to add to that idea, I wanted to draw him driving down Radical Highway, which is a level in the Sonic game that Shadow first appeared in. And it's like this magical, I don't know, fantastical, maybe is the better word, highway system that kind of floats around in space and, well, not in literal space, but in the world. It's got a lot of winding roads just kind of floating around. So I'm like, I'm going to draw him on a motorcycle going down the highway. And since they have a lot of hills in those roads, he can be going downhill and using his shoes that have like this air pocket hovering capability that he can use his shoes to kind of keep him propelled up so he doesn't just fall over on the motorcycle. So the very first sketch I showed had his shoes in the angle you see there, and the second sketch I showed had his head at a more downward angle facing the camera. So those first two sketches of me really excited, wanting to start the illustration, but not yet starting the illustration, led to this sketch here of combining those two angles that I liked into the scene, and then, you know, sketching a rough background, which I didn't like, but there's more on that later. And once I had a really rough sketch laid out on the canvas, then it was time to start refining it. And the way I approached it this time was you just kind of do whatever sounds fun when you're trying to just experiment and have fun with an illustration. So I started not doing line art per se, but just a more polished version of the original sketch with this light blue color and playing with layer settings to see how it would look, and then starting to add base colors on the character, in which the original base color was too bright, so I darkened it and then used the original bright color as some lighting on the character's face. And that was a constant battle. I wanted to set it up as if I were drawing with metallic art supplies on black paper, so then I made the canvas black on my iPad to emulate that. So having a black background made me focus on really the light source and made me very deliberate with how I picked colors, because it was an interesting challenge to kind of realize that the colors you would normally pick on a white backdrop are way too bright on a black backdrop. So I'd have to pick really dark colors, and it was It was like retraining my brain. But I really wanted to focus on the light source because that was another huge part of the inspiration of the things I mentioned that I saw was these light sources that were reflecting on the character, between one where it was like lights and reflections and the other was lightning and glowing stuff. So it made me want to think about that and how I could create some interesting lighting with this character, maybe giving a little glow to his shoes that could reflect on him and the motorcycle and things like that. An important part for my digital art processes lately has been constantly keeping everything just imperfect in a way where I can do a really rough sketch and maybe barely refine the rough sketch and then just throw colors underneath the sketch, and they don't even have to be filled in perfectly like in the lines or all of the colors there, but instead just kind of throwing colors on there to see how it looks in one blurry, messy cacophony of art. And then I have the opportunity to go over things little by little and refine the details, chisel away at things so that it constantly keeps the process fun, where I'm not having to be robotic with how I create things and just stiffen all of my art. Instead, it can constantly remain loose. I have the opportunity to experiment and try all kinds of crazy things and use all kinds of crazy colors and throw it onto the canvas and just see what happens. And I like to use a pencil tool primarily for my coloring. Sometimes I'll use a soft airbrush for other things, but I mainly use the pencil tool. And what I love about it is it gives a look like a traditional art feel. It gives a lot of texture, but it's like you can constantly go over everything. Because in real life, if you were drawing with a colored pencil, there would be limits to where you'd hit a point where you can't keep putting a new colored pencil on top of what other colored pencil you already laid down on the page. Whereas digital art, I have total freedom where I can just throw anything at it and it won't be impossible to do that. So it's just fun experimentation. It allows me as the artist to play with what I create rather than focus on perfection, because then it just kind of takes away from the art. It stiffens it. It makes it look robotic and, dare I say, AI generated. Admittedly, I have found myself trying to change how I draw digitally so that it doesn't look artificially generated. Because there was a time I liked to use really soft airbrushes and render everything very soft and perfect. And there was one illustration that I made, I posted it on Instagram, of a character hugging a palm tree. And I initially had the shading very soft and everything. But I was looking at it and I thought, this looks like it could be AI generated. I'm like, what can I do to change it up? So I used the pencil tool and I started just coloring over it. And it added a lot of grit and texture to the drawing, and it almost made it imperfect. And I was like, this is what I want. And it's kind of caused me to just use the pencil tool ever since. And so I'm always trying to experiment and explore different styles, different ways I can draw things. Because why confine myself to one niche, one small little box? So as for this drawing, I experimented with a lot of color variations and stuff. I wanted to give Shadow like a leather jacket and like a spiky belt and stuff, not just to make him look all edgy like he always is, but also to give it, well, I like drawing clothes, so I like to draw fun patterns and stuff, and I wanted to use it as an opportunity to also draw like attention to him as a character. Since he's just black and red, it's primarily his color scheme. There's still that black and red color scheme in the background, so I didn't want it to just like take away from him. So I thought the jacket, adding detail to that, can kind of like point the eye to him in the center. And then I could play with like patterns and putting little Easter egg references in there somewhere. But also, I know realistically, it is a wise decision to wear leather or jeans and things like that to protect yourself if you get flung off the motorcycle. So, there's that part of me too that's like, let's be a little realistic. He may not be looking out for his safety, but I'm looking out for his safety. Although he should be wearing a helmet, but I mean, I don't know. Can anyone find a hedgehog-sized helmet for him to wear? Anyone? Another change I've made to my digital art process lately is I've been drawing with canvases that have a much higher pixel count than what I initially used. And because of that, it gives me a lot of opportunity to really zoom in and have a really crisp image, but also it gives me even more opportunity to draw really little details and have fun with that, because it may not be details that people will ever bother to zoom in to find or see. So then I get to do it just for me, So even art that I'm gonna share can still be a little personal. So just between, adding little hexagon textures to his shoes, or adding little details to his belt, or adding little square textures to the tongue of his shoe to kind of give it a little pixely look, I can experiment with that kind of thing. But I also can insert little Easter egg references and things wherever I so choose. So there's quite a few of them in there, between details in the environment, maybe on the motorcycle, even hidden somewhere in his clothing or on him himself. I put in little things just for fun, to see, hey, anyone notice? Anyone paying attention? And I'm not necessarily going to show all of the Easter eggs in this illustration process, though if you pay close enough attention, you might be able to see some of them as I'm drawing. Or you could look at the final drawing in the end and zoom in and see if you can find them all. And feel free to let me know, too, what you did notice, because I'm curious, what's going to be easy Easter eggs for people to notice and what are going to be ones that maybe no one's ever caught. It's a little game I like to play. It was at this point I was ready to change the background I had given Shadow, so I started doing some sketches to get to know Radical Highway and thinking about different angles I could put into the scene. So I had this second concept and this third concept of different backgrounds for Radical Highway, and I went with number 3! I began working on filling in some base colors and thinking about what this new environment could look like. Another thing here that you're seeing me drawing is a blimp that's in Radical Highway. Shadow's origin game and the origin of this Radical Highway is Sonic Adventure 2. I've never played that, but I have played Radical Highway in Sonic Generations on the 3DS, so not the new one that just came out. But in that, it has this blimp that says "Got Ring," right? Well, it has this little spotlight, and at least in the Generations version, I don't know about the original game, but it shows this blimp, and it kind of chases after Sonic, and the blimp light kind of points at him and stuff. So I wanted to include the blimp because I thought that would be kind of a fun little detail. So when I did the first background, I had drawn in that blimp thinking maybe I can do it where it's chasing after Shadow or something, but it was taking away from Shadow. It just didn't look right. The background was just sloping way too high up, where it just, none of it looked right, which is why I started reworking the background. So I wanted a lower horizon line, something that wouldn't take away from Shadow, but could still be an interesting and detailed background. And looking at reference photos for starting the new background, I noticed that there's some skyscrapers in Radical Highway with Easter eggs. Well, one I had already known about, but I'll talk about that one later. But there's this other skyscraper that I am going to talk about that says Sonic Team on it. So I was like, ah ha ha, the Sonic Team including themselves into the game. So I had to include that skyscraper in the background. It was helpful looking at reference pictures of Radical Highway because drawing skyscrapers is always kind of these tall buildings that have a lot of reflections, not a lot of details or angles. They're, just square buildings with square windows. So looking at this was really helpful to see how the team created some variety with these skyscrapers, and that it didn't have to be as complicated as I thought it had to. So I was able to draw squares, but just with different colors, and draw them at different angles and stuff to give it this sort of variety without having to be hyper detailed with the background and take away from the foreground with our character in the center of it all, And then it came time to draw the fencing around the highway that have these directional arrows in case you don't know which way is forward. And so I started drawing all of those arrows in individually, which got a little monotonous, but it was still kind of interesting because I would have drawn them just more pointed at the tips, but I noticed that they had more of like this slanted edge, which I thought was kind of interesting. So it made it easier to focus on how to draw them in perspective as they kind of fade away into the background. And I also drew some street lamps on the highway. That way I could have opportunity later on to draw like the light cascading over the highway, gives me more lighting opportunity, and can't pass that up. Approaching the background was the same as drawing the character. I left the background really roughly sketched, and I used multiple different colors to sketch said background. And then adding in base colors, adding in basic details that I know I need to have with the background. But it's still very rough. It's imperfect. It's got a lot of wonky lines. Things aren't perfectly colored in. But I know I'll be able to go over and refine things as I'm doing with that bridge, doing with like the little signs in the background. The blimp's gonna get polished. Also I had to add that texture to the blimp to make it look more ribbed like a blimp is, which was still kind of tricky because it has that got ring text on top of it, which I think is always kind of a funny reference they threw in that game, like a got milk reference. I don't know. But anyhow, so just refining those details, and then I can add in the lighting and really be able to sharpen up the image and refine things to where you don't see as many of the rough sketch lines, though I still like to leave a little bit of that in there. It gives it that sense of motion. So of course you can anticipate that I'm also doing the same tactic with drawing in the motorcycle. For doing the motorcycle, I used two different references, one of Shadow's actual motorcycle in his game, the Shadow game, and then of a motorcycle, like of a real motorcycle that matches that same front handlebar system. I don't know what those motorcycles are called, so motorcycle experts don't come for me. Using the reference of Shadow's motorcycle, I noticed that his back tire kind of sticks out higher than the front tire at the handlebar, and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's an interesting angle because it kind of sticks out further out from the motorcycle, and it's taller, so it's kind of like the same look of like a wasp's behind. I know that's a really weird example, but that's all I can think of. And so I tried to emulate that with his motorcycle, but I am aware it probably comes across like his motorcycle is breaking in half as he's going down the hill, which maybe it is. But it was also better to do it that way because the way I drew him with his legs sticking forward in the foreground, it makes it's just better to have the tire pushed a little further back. Because I thought about it, I tried moving it closer to him so it looks like it's not falling off of his motorcycle, but it just didn't look right. It created almost kind of a tangent issue, so that's why I had to do it that way. I was trying to be accurate while being inaccurate. Another thing about Radical Highway is it also has directional arrows on the road itself, just in case you still don't know which direction to go down the highway. And so I started drawing those in, which was kind of tricky because you want to draw the arrows in accurately, like to the perspective you've given of the road. So I hid shadow so I could kind of focus in on that. But at the same time, you don't want like these glaring bright arrows underneath him because it kind of takes away from it, and you'll see an example of that in a few seconds here. Just a little more, we're almost there. Yep, see how that kind of takes away from him. So I used a charcoal brush with like a black color and kind of went over it to give that road texture, that gravel texture, and still keep the arrows, but they're not bright and overkill. Next, I used like a really saturated blue and yellow together, and I set them to motion blur, and I shot them up vertically. That creates not only a sense of motion as he's going down the road without having to blur a lot of the background, but it also emulates that light leak, that light pollution of a nighttime scene with a lot of city lights and skyscrapers and everything. And then after that, I started adding a little more detail to the railing around the highway because I noticed, looking a little closer in the reference photo, that it wasn't just a fence with arrows on it. They designed it where it's kind of like sunken in some areas, and then there's like a second middle part that sticks out further on the railing and has like these little bolts nailed into it. It's kind of hard for me to describe, not knowing how to describe it, but that's essentially what it was. So I decided to add that detail in, which overall just made it look a lot better. So I'm glad they did that, and I'm glad I noticed they did that. Otherwise it would have looked really flat and just not as good. So it just gives it more of a sense of like someone actually built railing on a highway and not someone drew some rectangles on the side of a road. And then adding in some pink shading to the arrows to make them seem also more three-dimensional, which I think was the same color they did in the actual scene. So that was nice. Kept it all very cohesive and colorful and fun. My main colors for light, other than just a brighter variant of a hue of something in the scene, was blue and yellow. Those were my main light source colors. Mainly because blue was kind of the overall sensation of the background between the skyscrapers and the light they're projecting, and yellow was that additional light between the lights on the street lamps, lights on Shadow's shoes, the lights on his motorcycle headlight. Having that helped keep things cohesive, not introducing too many new colors, so it was still easier to focus on where I wanted you to focus in the scene. And we're nearing the finish line here of the illustration, so everything now is just constantly refining little details, adding more lighting in places, pulling it all together, making sure that everything is being realistically affected by the light, that it's all together in unison in the piece. So once I had that, then it came time to add the remaining Easter eggs, because honestly I was having so much fun with the illustration because I was like at my desk drawing and listening to music and stuff, so I was like, I don't want to stop. So I was staring at the piece like, what more could I add to this? Well, another thing in Radical Highway that Sega added was another character from another Sega game franchise called Knights. They put this character's head on the top of one of the skyscrapers, and I initially thought about doing that in the illustration, but having another character's head somewhere on a building in the background I felt like would take away from Shadow in the foreground, so I decided to draw Knights getting busted by the blimp. And then, in addition to that, I decided to draw a tiny little cream further away in the background on the road, drawing Sonic and Blaze in chalk. And oh, I also drew cheese floating next to her, because what's cream without cheese? What inspired me to do that is when I started this illustration, I was actually on vacation in Vermont. And so I had like drawn 2 separate days working on that there, and then I kind of stopped working on the illustration, and then I came back to it a while later when I got home. But while we were in Vermont, we were at this restaurant that had a chalkboard on the wall. And so my dad was like, I'm going to draw something and I'm going to record you drawing it. And so I drew Sonic and Blaze on the chalkboard because I can. And then later on, I also came across something in the road where people were drawing stuff in chalk. So I drew Sonic in chalk. Kind of hence why I did that. It was on the mind, drawing things in chalk. And I was like, what character would be drawing chalk on the road from this franchise? Well, of course it would be Cream, because she's a youngin'. She is a huge support for Sonic and Blaze, so that's why I drew her drawing them, because she would be the one to do that. Of course I drew some blue light affecting her, and then I drew Big in the background fishing on one of the skyscrapers with Froggy next to him, and then I also drew the tornado somewhere in the background as well. Yeah, just a few of the Easter eggs for you. But once I did that, then I had to finish the illustration. So starting with the first sketch, then the second sketch, that led to the sketch for the illustration, and then adding in the second sketch, adding in some colors. I initially put lightning on the spikes, but I don't like that, so I got rid of it, reduced the size of his chest fur, and then thinking about a different background, one that would not take away from the character but would still be more interesting. Then coming up with 2 new background ideas and going with the second idea, filling in the base colors and then making the road wider because I wanted it to feel like a huge background behind him. Adding in the lighting and all the little details, and the illustration was finished. Because this illustration was so much fun to work on, it constantly forced me to look at it and go, how can I add more to this? How can I level up my art? And it really feels like a huge improvement. I can't wait to see now what I've learned from this, how I can improve my art going forward. So thank you for watching, and may God bless you in your life and your art. Bye!